Hello friends. A little bit ago, I decided to start making videos about what I actually do believe instead of only talking about what I don't believe. It's all well and good for me to make videos about why I don't believe certain claims of the Catholic Church, but I think it's fun to explain where I'm at now, where my beliefs have kind of fallen in the void left by my formerly Catholic beliefs. Today, I want to outline my thoughts about morality. Let's begin. Back when I was Catholic, I was a moral realist, though I may not have used that title. I think that the Catholic position on morality is captured pretty clearly in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Part 3, Section 1, Chapter 1, Article 4, the morality of human acts. Line 1749 reads, "Freedom makes man a moral subject. When he acts deliberately, man is, so to speak, the father of his acts. Human acts, that is, acts that are freely chosen in consequence of a judgment of conscience, can be morally evaluated. They are either good or evil." Lines 1750 through 1754 define the conditions that determine the morality of an act, namely the object, the intention, and the circumstance. Then, line 1755 clearly defines morally good acts and contrasts them against morally evil acts. A morally good act requires the goodness of the object, of the end, and of the circumstances together. An evil end corrupts the action, even if the object is good in itself, such as praying and fasting, quote, in order to be seen by men. The object of the choice can, by itself, vitiate an act in its entirety. There are some concrete acts, such as fornication, that it is always wrong to choose, because choosing them entails a disorder of the will that is a moral evil. I can't find any Catholic teaching that says moral facts exist or moral realism is true or anything like that. As far as I can tell, the Church works from an assumption that moral realism is true and then acts accordingly, defining how we evaluate moral acts and how to act in a moral manner. Catholics, if I'm wrong about this, please let me know. But when I started dropping my beliefs that I was supposed to hold as a Catholic, I held on to my belief in moral realism. My intuition was so strong, and I didn't see any reason to drop my belief in moral realism. And besides, I didn't want to give up my belief in moral realism. I took great comfort in the black and white nature of morality that was instilled in me as a traditionalist Catholic. And I carried that with me considerably longer than I held my belief that the Catholic Church is the one true church. For a while, I called myself a moral realist a la Sam Harris. Sam Harris, in his 2010 book, The Moral Landscape, argues that science can answer moral questions, since morality is really only a question about human well-being. At first, I was pretty convinced that this was true and that all religious people secretly agreed that morality really was about human well-being, even if they said that they didn't. After all, religious morality, regardless of the religion we're talking about, seems to be all about securing your spot in the afterlife. And isn't that essentially just ultimate well-being? There's nothing better than human flourishing than going to heaven, especially when pitted against hell, which was instilled in me as a kid and is still the predominant view among religious people today. But then the growing popularity of veganism made me question, is morality really all about human flourishing? Some vegans seem to say that morality is actually about the flourishing of all sentient living things. And besides, are we so sure that religious people actually agree that human flourishing is the basis of morality? If you speak to certain hardline religious people, they'll tell you that morality is actually all just about the glory of God. If God desired to send us to hell, that would be fair, because we deserve it. We are all sinners worthy of hell anyway. And so if God lets us into heaven, it's not because we deserve it. So we ought to act morally, not to get to heaven, but because we should glorify God, and that's what morality is all about. So if morality isn't about human flourishing, what is morality all about? To be honest, I don't think that this question has one answer. It has tons of answers depending on who you ask. And since I cannot make any objective claims about morality without knowing what morality is even about, I'm left with nothing. Just this intuition that morality is real and objective, even though I can't tell you what it is. And then I read this paper, Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale, by Dan Loeb from the University of Vermont, published in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, Volume 23, Number 1 in 2003. This paper is super interesting. Let's just dive right into it. It begins, the debate over moral realism has a long and complicated history. Much less has been said, however, about realism concerning other sorts of value. Perhaps one of the least initially appealing of these involves a commitment to the objective goodness and badness of various foods and beverages. Such a view, which we can call gastronomic realism, holds that there are facts about gastronomic value. Facts which are similarly independent of our beliefs. So, on the face of it, this seems ridiculous, right? And you might want to call this paper a reductio ad absurdum, stating that gastronomic realism is clearly false, and if all of the arguments for moral realism are the same as the arguments for gastronomic realism, then certainly both should be false. Well, that's not exactly the direction that this paper takes. It's a little humbler than that. Let's keep reading. What exactly is gastronomic realism? At a minimum, it's the view that gastronomic value properties, or GVPs, are real. So let's get more into the reductio part. Moral realists will often claim that there should be a presumption in favor of moral realism based on human intuition. Paper reads, moral realists often argue that moral realism should be our meta-ethical starting point, the default view, unless decisive objections to it are found. Gastronomic realists may wish to avail themselves of a presumption of just this sort. In the spirit of their moral realist counterparts, they may ask why gastronomic realism needs a defense. Again, this sounds absurd when you're talking about gastronomic realism, but I'm not certain what the symmetry breaker is between gastronomic realism and moral realism. The paper continues. The argument from disagreement is the same. The argument from disagreement is perhaps the most prominent objection that's been raised against moral realism. A similar argument can be directed at gastronomic value properties. Disagreement about which foods are good are notoriously common. My son insists that caviar is awful. I find it exquisite. The author does admit that he is lying, but some people do find caviar exquisite. As moral realists often remind us, the ability to appreciate things of value, such as other people's rights and interests, may require a certain sophistication developed over long periods of time, and we can expect disagreement among the less sophisticated, or between the more and the less sophisticated. But this sort of disagreement does not threaten realism about gastronomic value properties either, or at least it threatens moral value properties the same as it threatens gastronomic value properties. Then there's the argument from explanation. The argument stems from the view very roughly that it's sensible to believe of a kind of entity or property if and only if we can fit that entity or property into our best available explanation schema. The challenge to the moral realist then is to show us how moral facts can explain and why we should believe what they explain. If there's no place for moral facts in our best global explanatory picture, then Harman's argument suggests that we would have no good reason to believe in them, and so no reason to treat our moral intuitions as having any evidentiary force. So we could apply the same things to gastronomic value properties, right? Well, moral realists like to argue that moral realism does actually explain certain things such as human behavior, but gastronomic value properties can also explain certain aspects of human behavior. Of course they can, argues the gastronomic realist. Why do people pay such high prices? Because the food is so good at that certain restaurant. Why hasn't Ben & Jerry's come out with a ketchup and onion flavored ice cream? Because that would be an awful flavor, an objectively awful flavor. There is a point in the paper where he takes the argument from queerness on. I'm going to skip that because, frankly, I don't understand the argument from queerness very well. And then the paper ends with a confession. I confess, says the author, that when I began this project, I was more tempted by the possibility of such a reductio than I am now. On more careful reflection, I think it is wiser to withhold judgment on that question. And the author finishes, arbitrary or not, in the end, we're all in the same boat. In this respect, moral or gastronomic irrealism is no harder to swallow than moral realism. So where does that leave me? Well, I more or less accept the reductio ad absurdum approach. I don't think that the reasons to accept moral realism are very good, and if they were good, that would probably prompt me to accept gastronomic realism as well. But I'm not a gastronomic realist. I'm not a moral realist either. I've discarded both through Occam's razor, and I'm left being a moral anti-realist. You know what's funny too is that Sam Harris makes an analogy to food in the TED Talk that he did about 10 years ago, shortly after The Moral Landscape was published. He says,
notice that the fact that the concept of health is open, genuinely open for revision, does not make it vacuous. Okay, the distinction between a healthy person and a dead one is about as clear and consequential as any we make in science. Now, another thing to notice is there may be many peaks on the moral landscape. There may be equivalent ways to thrive. Okay, there may be equivalent ways to organize a human society so as to maximize human flourishing. Now, why wouldn't this undermine an objective morality? Well, think of how we talk about food. I would never be tempted to argue to you that there must be one right food to eat. There's clearly a range of materials that constitute healthy food. But there's nevertheless a clear distinction between food and poison. Okay, the fact that there are many right answers to the question, what is food, does not tempt us to say that there are no truths to be known about human nutrition.
So Sam Harris strikes me as a gastronomic realist. Very consistent of you, Sam. Now, that might not quite be true because Sam substitutes the word nutrition in. I do agree that there are truths to be known about human nutrition, just as I agree that there are truths to be known about human flourishing. And if you mean human flourishing, when you say morality, then yeah, I can be a moral realist or a moral realist. But I think that the more precise way of phrasing that is that I could be a human flourishing realist, not a moral realist, since I don't think that everybody agrees about what morality is. And until we do, I don't think that I can call myself a moral realist. That's it for today, everybody. I really like putting these kinds of videos together. I like telling you what I actually believe instead of just what I don't believe. So if you like these two, drop a comment down below. If you disagree with me, let me know. If you're a Catholic and you think that I'm just way out of line, shoot me an email, nontraditionalcatholic@gmail.com. I'd love to have you on for an episode of Conversations with Catholics. And with that, until next time.